T-R-I-T-I-C. I got right it on that. I remember that.
We were there one day and it had a video or something.
We
well,
the species.
they have and also,
I was got scared.
Which one, modern art or?
yeah, the modern art and the young and National Legion.
Actually, that was a good deal.
Yeah, it's very good.
Yeah.
Critica.
How are you? Good.
Did you come up with that, or did he come up with that?
Well, Kimberly.
Kimberly
first day slots.
Oh.
You know, and she always picks up onion, cream cheese. That's day what it is. It's like, I don't know whether it's the Jenner or what have you.
Yeah, I know triticum.
You know it?
I know it's a kind of wheat. That's all I know.
Presentation, you want donuts.
That's true. Can we put in a request for donuts? You're the man that's organized.
Glenn's in South America, so he's the one to talk to.
Well, you're the one that you're the ones. You're the heir apparent, aren't you?
Heir apparent.
Heir apparent. Heir apparent. Yeah, let's get donuts again. It's good.
It's too healthy.
Maple cream and chocolate covered. So what do you got growing this week?
You know, I asked
Actually, my daylilies,
Are they
they're
gonna-
not out, but the greens are.
Yeah, I'll give my
credit.
And,
You have camellias?
it's growing.
You have camellias. You must have camellias.
My neighbor has a huge
And
camellia
forsythias.
tree.
Glenn's in South America.
I have my candy bushes are also starting to
Flash up
come out
there.
of the ground. I'm trying to wake up.
What's Glenn doing in South America? Is he doing the Machu Picchu and
He's done that. He's like Argentina, Brazil.
so he's going to Patagonia and then
I don't know. I know that he's already done Machu
There's
Picchu,
lots of
so probably.
daffodils also. And there's
I want to do that, and one of my friends is doing that plus the Galapagos on one trip. They're going to do Machu Picchu and the Galapagos and come back.
And we did that last year. It's one of the great trips of a lifetime.
Yeah.
Have you done it?
No, that's one of the ones I want to go
Yeah,
on.
it's got 2 bucket lists on one trip. It took about, most of the trips are at least 3 weeks, which is a long time. You can find them in about 12 days. Because you know, as a doctor, you gotta leave them.
You can, but you got to be retired before it's good.
Well, and the other thing is you're not salaried. You're producing money the whole time.
Yeah, my wife keeps saying that. Well, you know, you get paid. I said, no, I don't get paid when I'm on vacation. You get paid when you're on vacation. She doesn't remember that.
So I did. So this wouldn't happen anyway.
The only guy that obviously was John Lewis.
I brought my work. Allergy clinic. Have you attended that? Well, doing signing the electronics, I got an email last night from some billing person down in the Columbia Tower saying my attestation statement is not in the right place. She can read it. She can read it. It's in the wrong place. I gotta go back into it. Oh my God. This is
Mike, the world's going to stop until you put that in the right place. Her life will not go on until you put that in the right place.
really, her address is Columbia Tower. She works in the Columbia Tower downtown.
Yeah, no, maybe it's Columbia Tower over in like the Rainier Valley. Maybe it's a different Columbia Tower.
That's the name of the bar. Well, that was very speculated. I know that on Machu Picchu, so I guess it was there. It's very
In Buenos Aires, Santiago and Chile.
Hey, good morning.
No, I gotta do that.
So Matt, what'd you think of Pam Kutcher?
Yeah, well, I'll talk to you afterwards. We're starting her on IDIG.
Really?
Yeah, she's okay with it.
She's a piece of work.
Yeah, she's a character. She's got real
Oh no, I realized that. It was, but Nancy's just got, in the last couple of months, it just went to crap really fast. You're getting Sailor Wolf back too. She started having infusion reactions from her Isentra. She's just getting wiped out for 3 or 4 days. She's missed like half this week here already. She's 12. And her infection's 6. Her mom says, oh, they don't stop right away, but she's missing school all the time. Feels terrible after 3 days, and she gets them twice a week. So I guess she feels good 1 day a week. So I did some serologies for immune complexes and stuff. They're on the eat it. I said, you know what? You got to go back and see what they think.
I've been to.
But it seems like you're my new partner now, since I'm sending everybody
I've been to
down there.
Copenhagen, so I've been to some, and I haven't been listening in, like, could I say this to you? I've been to Stockholm, I've been to. She couldn't tolerate ID.
No, she's on Hizentra. No, she's just a kid. You started her right on Hizentra. You know, theoretically, it's cheaper as long as they get it through children. So if they get it through Walgreens and Everett, it costs more than $90.
It's supposed to be cheaper.
Yeah, they charge $150 a day to monitor them.
Even if they're not ID.
No, when they get their Hizentra, they charge them $150 a day to monitor.
Every day of the month.
$4,500 for monitoring. So we're trying to never use them again.
Yeah.
I have no idea what yeah. Now you can write it down. Now we're actually writing it.
All right, let's get started. Len's in South America, so he's leaving this up to me to get started on time. You want to let him down. Word of the day is triticum. Dave's going to explain to us about what that is. And, no, this is a great subject, gluten. He's going to explain it all in an hour today, so yeah, this is great.
These are gluten-free bagels that we're eating.
Almost bagel on bagels.
Let's do this right. Okay. Well, as you can all see, that the name of the talk is the gluten-free bandwagon fad or fact. I think a reason why I chose to do this talk is, as all of you know, and all of us know this in clinical practice particularly, where we have a number of patients coming to see us who don't necessarily have, they might end up not having IgE-mediated food allergy. They may have been evaluated by their gastroenterologist and have been ruled out for celiac, and in those cases, what do we do? And I wanted to review the studies, if any, on gluten sensitivity and gluten-related disorders. So here we go. Here's some disclosures which should not be relevant to this talk. Ooh. There we go. Interesting. Didn't know that this was going to come up like this. So here's the outline. A little fancier presentation here. We're going to talk about the introduction to introduce you guys to wheat and gluten. We know what these things are. We'll also talk about the so-called evolution of gluten, also current popular theory about gluten, and the gluten-free trend that we've all been seeing in recent years. Spend a few slides on whether this gluten-free diet could actually be harmful or not. A lot of people will just go on it blindly, so we'll talk about that in general. And then the spectrum of gluten or wheat-related disorders, namely, we'll spend a little bit of time on celiac disease, wheat allergy. We won't be talking too much about allergy because this is what we can diagnose or rule out in our clinics, and this is referring to IgE-mediated wheat allergy. We'll spend the majority of the time talking about this, which is non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So where's the science? We'll be talking about mainly the science or the studies that are on non-celiac gluten sensitivity. Now, if there's time, and I'm kind of a pack rat with my slides, and I didn't want to take these all out, but I kept the slides on gluten and autism spectrum disorder, as well as something called gluten ataxia. If we don't get to it, that's okay. We'll just have these slides as a reference. The data on these things is not strong, but it certainly raises an eyebrow. And we'll then, if there's not time, we'll just skip from non-celiac gluten sensitivity to the final slide, which is conclusions and final thought. So this is a cartoon. So when you search for gluten sensitivity or gluten intolerance or gluten-free, a lot of interesting, fun things come up. So this was a slide looking at a couple of friends driving down the street in their convertible. It looks to me like California. I think Southern California. One says to the other, "I have no idea what gluten is either, but I'm avoiding it just to be safe." So the word triticum, I think, comes from this It's a scientific word for the wheat species that is in food production currently. So we know what wheat is. Where a lot of us are eating it right now. It's a very common grain and contributing to 50% of calories throughout the world, and a leading source of vegetable protein in human food. And compared to other major cereals like corn or rice, it actually has a higher protein content. World trade for wheat is greater than for all other crops combined, and global consumption has actually increased faster than any other cereal. And when you look at each of us in general in the United States, we've probably taken about 132 pounds per person yearly. So what is gluten? We know that many of us know that it's a protein found in wheat, rye, barley, sometimes oat, depending on how the oat's been processed. And you know, that elasticity of dough that we feel when we're kneading the dough. Not all of us will do that, but the elasticity that we feel, or actually when we're, you know, if someone's baking bread or making cookies, that rising that we see, that's where gluten comes in. It actually allows dough to rise, keep its shape, and that chewy texture that we're used to. Gluten also helps with that, and it's also used in certain skin care products and cosmetics and hair care products as well. Gluten is a combination of gliadin and glutenin, which are both proteins, and in genetically predisposed individuals, gliadin cannot be degraded, and those genetically predisposed individuals are most likely those patients with celiac disease. We can't degrade this gliadin by our intestinal enzymes, and therefore there's a triggered immune reaction in the gut. So are there different varieties of wheat or gluten? And there are, particularly when it comes to the components of wheat and gluten. As an example, over 50 gliadin epitopes exist, and some studies have looked at the toxicity of each component. They haven't really been able to quantify this necessarily, but there's some thoughts that each gluten protein might have a unique toxicity profile and distinct T-cell stimulatory sequences. And it's thought, and the theory is that in some cases, maybe older versions of wheat, they've done some studies on this, might be better tolerated with those with gluten-related disorders than the current strains used in food production. So what's going on with this whole evolution, or so-called evolution of gluten? The whole thought process is, back in the day when we were, foraging and hunting, we didn't have much exposure to grains. And in relatively more recent times, 10,000 years ago, we had revolutions in agriculture, making it possible to domesticate these grasses for the first time. And, could this agricultural age, could it have been a mistake of evolution? Now you're having conditions possibly now for human disease related to gluten exposure to come about. And as these developments spread, then there was some reports then looking at symptoms consistent with celiac disease being described. And since these 10,000 years since wheat was domesticated, about 25,000 modifications have been reported. And that's really the running theory here is that, now popular theory states that that maybe gluten and grains are just unhealthy. And this whole current obesity epidemic is really due to the high carbohydrate content of wheat, and that can transfer into many negative health aspects of the grain products. The other thought is, as we just mentioned, was these recent wheat modifications could have further increased the immunogenicity and carbohydrate content. This is just popular theory. This is not necessarily pure known fact. As talked about, the last point here is, 10,000 years, when you look at, in relative times, that's relatively recent from an evolutionary point of view, and that's too short to adapt to the specific contents of it. So that's current theory, and these sort of theories and hypotheses have really spread, as we know, in the lay press. We know that by patients coming and asking us what's going on with them, because they'll bring up wheat and gluten and dairy and all these other things. A lot of celebrities have kind of come on board and embraced this theory, making it more popular. And that's all well and good, but I think we need to look at the main point, which is whether gluten or those products derived from grains can actually be a cause of symptoms in the absence of celiac disease and in the absence of what we often see, which is IgE-mediated food allergy, wheat allergy specifically. So, Mintel, which is a private London-based research firm, looked at the gluten-free market, and it's big business. Gluten-free consumers, including those with celiac disease, and people who choose a wheat-free diet for lifestyle reasons, have really fueled this economy, or the gluten-free economy, I should say. The number of patients embracing the gluten-free diet is rapidly growing, and about 20% of the U.S. population are buying gluten-free products, and that's significantly larger than the actual amount of true celiac patients. In 2011, there was reports looking at the gluten-free market in the United States, accounting for about 1.3 billion, and is expected to rise. I like this slide. It kind of looks at the trends of 3 different diets, right? So back in the 2000s, it was a low-carb diet. Then there was a little blip here in 2006 looking at the fat-free diet. And now, since 2008, we've seen kind of a steady rise, and it's not really expected to go anywhere at this point. But since 2008, the gluten-free diet has really become more popular.
Do you know what the y-axis was? Like what percent that was?
I would have to pull up the actual paper. That's a good question.
Nice to have a picture of the scale.
Yeah.
I'll have to look that up. Yeah, no, that's a good question. The paper's here, so we can look at it afterwards. So, it seems like everyone and their mom and even pigeons these days may be on the gluten-free diet, right? So the suspected increase in gluten-related disorders, along with a significant number of people who just overall feel that this diet is healthier for them, that they feel better on it, really, as we talked about, has increased the demand of the gluten-free food market. And a majority of these patients really don't necessarily have celiac disease, as we talked about. And according to that same private research firm in London, a good chunk of these patients, 65%, do so because they just think it's healthier. I think this is a good thing in regards to patients who have celiac disease. In the United States, in 2013, the FDA actually defined the term gluten-free for voluntary use in food labels. And this is great for certain folks, but also what's caught into this is when you go to the grocery store and then you get a bottle of water or a bottle of flavored water and it also says gluten-free on it. It might be a little overkill in some cases. And the food, if it's going to meet these requirements of having that gluten-free label, it must not contain any gluten or gluten-containing grain. I should say, it should not contain an ingredient derived from a gluten-containing grain that has not been thoroughly processed to remove gluten. And the threshold that they use is at 20 parts per million. So it must not contain gluten-containing grains that have been processed that result in greater than 20 parts per million of gluten in food, or just contain any unavoidable presence of gluten at that level.
Do you know if that threshold is adequate for celiac? I know some people are exquisite.
Yeah, so very sensitive to it. No, I'm not sure. I don't know the exact answer to that question. I think, I didn't actually look that up, what the actual threshold is, but I think it's got to be well below what would be treated for celiac. Yeah. I don't know the actual number though.
I know it depends.
Yeah, and it's probably variable depending on the patient. Yeah, good question. So we're talking about this gluten-free diet. Now, can it be harmful? And that's a question. Generally, though, it's thought to be safe. I mean, that's the gist of it. It can provide all of the necessary requirements, assuming you're ingesting a balance of fruit and veggies and proteins and ancient grains. That's what they call it. Now, does everyone eat this nice balance of fruit and vegetables? Not necessarily. And so the thought is that some of these gluten-free foods may not have the same dietary supplementation as gluten-containing foods. I think that maybe this could be changing over time now that since 2008 we've shown a rise in popularity of this diet, and companies are actually taking note of this and are producing more products. Back in the day, it was hard to find a gluten-free restaurant. Back in the day, it was also hard to find many gluten-free foods. You had to go to a special baker to produce these things. And so now it's much more mainstream, and you're able to find these products more readily, and perhaps they may have better dietary supplementation than they used to have. So in order to look into this, there was a study out of Sweden, a Swedish study, looking at the vitamin nutritional status of celiac patients on a gluten-free diet for about 10 years, an average of 8 to 12 years, and they looked at 30 adults. And when you read this study, they mentioned that that after a few years of a gluten-free diet, this should have been shown to be safe by prior data, but they really didn't look into an extended amount of time. So this is what they kind of really sought out to do, is to say, well, if you're strictly gluten-free for 10 years or so, is that safe? And so what they ended up doing was looking at plasma homocysteine levels, which some of us may know is a metabolic marker for folate, vitamin B6, and B12 deficiency, and also related plasma vitamin levels. There's a 4-day food record, and they also looked at controls in the general population. For celiac patients who are on this strict gluten-free diet for a good 10 years had higher total plasma homocysteine levels than the general population, which is thought to be indicative of poor vitamin status. They looked at folate, an active form of vitamin B6, and that was also low, as well as looking at the mean daily intake during this 4-day food record. Yes, it was a short amount of time, and they found that folate and vitamin B12 were significantly lower. The intake was significantly lower in celiac patients versus control. So that's raises an eyebrow. To take the point also that I wanted to make is that these are patients who were on biopsy-proven remission. So these weren't patients where you can say, look, malabsorption is an issue. And furthermore, the zinc levels in these patients, which is apparently a measure of good mucosal status, or measure of mucosal status in the upper GI tract, was normal. And so we couldn't really say that this was secondary to the disease itself or the absorption. A second study looked at 47 patients in 2005. It was a relatively small sample size as well. And go ahead.
Speculate on a cause for that? I mean, are bread products supplemented with B6, B12, and folic acid, or is this just a
not in Sweden? It's a good question. So in Sweden, based on what they said from this study, that neither the bread, gluten-containing bread or gluten-free bread, they were not supplemented. So that could be a bit different story if this study were done in the United States in this day and age. That's a good question.
Well, but they are here.
Now they are here, so they are supplemented. Yeah, exactly.
They supplemented with thiamine B1.
Exactly. So I think that was one of the possible reasons. But then again, they had controls in that study too. So you'd expect them to both have lower levels. So they weren't entirely sure, and it always ends as more studies need to be done.
Whole wheat. I mean, I don't know what they were eating there, but whole wheat is also a major source of those vitamins. Right. So if you're not, you're getting a supplemented or
not. Yeah. So I mean that's a good point, and they didn't really have an exact answer as to why that's the case. Some other studies have tried to look into this. This was a study a few years later, a relatively smaller number of patients. It did have a small number of patients, I should say. There was 47 patients, and it was a 3-day self-reported study. And they found between males and females that in the female group, less than 50% of those female patients with celiac disease were consuming the recommended amounts of fiber, iron, and calcium. This was self-reported, so they felt that there could be some underreporting involved here. So these two studies really just kind of highlight the fact that in some cases, if we're not having a balanced diet, not eating, not being followed by a dietitian, and not being followed by a gastroenterologist, perhaps, who's going to look at your vitamin levels, that we might not be adequately supplementing our diet properly with a strict gluten-free diet. So where did this come from? Where did the gluten-free diet come from? Really, the first description was celiac disease, what was in the 2nd century AD, and gluten-free diet essentially stemmed from all of this. So in 1888, celiac disease was more described in more detail, and then in World War II, Dutch pediatrician showed that and his celiac disease patients improved when wheat was unavailable. And then when after the war, when cereal grains again became plentiful, the incidence of celiac disease quickly returned to pre-war levels. And so this Dutch pediatrician is now thought to be the pioneer of the gluten-free diet. And this is really where the gluten-free diet stemmed from, was from, of course, from celiac patients. Let's spend a few slides on this. This is not necessarily talking about celiac disease, but as we should be reminded, it is a chronic enteropathy and a heightened immunologic response to gluten or related proteins, resulting in villous atrophy of the small intestine, increased intestinal permeability and malabsorption. And the cornerstone of treatment for celiac disease is a strict gluten-free diet. When you look at global prevalence, it does seem to be increasing. In the United States, also seems to be increasing, and it can't really be fully explained by improved serology or better recognition. Just some background: when you look at testing for celiac, the HLA-DQ2 is carried by about 90% of patients, and DQ8 is carried by about 5% of patients. And of note, when it comes to the DQ allele, 30% of the general population actually has this, but doesn't necessarily mean you have celiac disease. Just as a reminder, about 3% only go on to develop celiac disease. So in medical school, we would look at these. You've got a question about a kid with celiac disease. This is what you would kind of picture, right? Your classic celiac patient who's has onset in childhood, but over the past few decades here, we've kind of really been seeing more non-classical celiac disease in patients who are coming out of the woodwork later. And so the recent data really is looking into this loss of tolerance to gluten, not necessarily occurring at the time of gluten being introduced, but could occur at any point due to some sort of unknown environmental trigger. So there's still some questions when it comes to celiac disease itself. And it's being increasingly difficult to recognize, really as demonstrated by the data from the American Society of Pediatrics and Allergy, and also the European counterparts in Europe, looking at different extraintestinal manifestations of celiac disease, ranging from iron deficiency anemia to abnormal liver function to dental enamel hypoplasia.
Dave, do you come across any sort of microbiome data related to that? In other words, that if you have this profile, it accelerates.
Not that I could find. Yeah, not that I could find. We will talk about a little bit about in IBS patients, not necessarily in celiac disease. There's something called the FODMAPs diet, which allows the substrate by bacteria to go in there and cause problems. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So, patients with celiac disease might feel this way, where they feel that patients who are going gluten-free makes, when they go to a restaurant, they say I have to be gluten-free. Now that it's kind of quote unquote thought to be a fad, some people with celiac disease feel that makes them sound like a hipster, right? So now when we have a patient that comes to see us, all joking aside, let's say they don't have celiac disease, and you see the notes from the gastroenterologist, and let's say you choose to do skin testing and felt that was appropriate for that patient, and that's negative. Do we judge these patients? Do we say, well, there's nothing wrong with them and they should go home? Or perhaps these patients are actually gluten intolerant or gluten sensitive without celiac disease. And so, why should we care about gluten if these patients don't have celiac disease, or perhaps, let's say they don't have IgE-mediated food allergy? So, as we talked about, I think food allergy and intolerance really remains an important chief complaint, at least in my clinical practice. Patients come to see me with those sort of questions. They always mention gluten. I think dairy is a close second, if not first, being implicated possibly in their symptoms. And it's thought by some accounts that these gluten-related disorders affect about 10% or up to 10% of the population. I think it's important to educate patients about the differences between intolerance and food allergy. I think they'll leave our offices a little bit more happy if their skin tests are negative, and even in those cases, at least they left with some more information. I think we should be well informed of the information, if any, whether it might not be strong science, whether it be strong science or not. We just have to know what's out there when it comes to the data. And this entity called non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which we talked about a little bit earlier, is a condition really becoming more recognized by the medical community. So to the right here on this table, we see wheat allergy, which we know clearly about. You can do skin testing for serum-specific IgE. Then on the left, you see celiac disease, which we talked about. Then appropriately in the gray area here, we have non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which thought to be can occur hours to days. There's really no good testing for it. Thought to be needed, as we'll talk about, and there's really no solid confirmatory testing. As you can see here, I wrote down gluten and autism spectrum disorder, gluten ataxia with question marks that could possibly fit under this large umbrella of non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So as far as a case scenario, at least a scenario that I see in clinic often, and a lot of us do see, a 57-year-old female with GI symptoms and bloating and mild abdominal pain, suspected to be from grains. She mentions gluten and wheat specifically. She's still eating these products regularly and has not avoided them yet. Just for the purposes of this case scenario, this patient has been seen by gastroenterology and serology has been done for celiac, which was negative. And you decide that it's appropriate to do skin testing because the symptoms may occur within a couple hours, and the serum, the skin testing was negative to wheat. So what do you do in this case? Do you just say your skin tests are negative, not a problem, just keep eating wheat and don't worry about it? That could be an answer. And the other question is, do we entertain this whole non-celiac gluten sensitivity diagnosis? So a guy named Daniel McCarter, who's a physician in the University of Virginia, has kind of, I like his approach. I think is a very practical approach to the diagnosis of management of gluten sensitivity. So let's say you get a patient who presents with these symptoms related to gluten sensitivity, and they've gone through a formal evaluation. Of course, if they're positive, you would probably be seen by a gastroenterologist and end up getting a biopsy, etc. And if it's negative, then the general, he really recommends just generally a better diet, saying, look, let's eat less fried foods, let's put some more fiber in your diet, more fruits and vegetables, and doesn't tell them to go gluten-free, but just really tries to modify their diet and to see if symptoms improve or not. And if they do, then you go on with this general dietary improvement. And if not, then you could consider a gluten-free diet in this context. And if symptoms improve, then you can continue the gluten-free diet. I think I would certainly consider reintroduction of gluten after a symptom-free period. And of course, consider a placebo effect. And if not, if no symptoms improve and the patient's been really adherent to this gluten-free diet, then you can reevaluate for other causes.
Has everybody just taken a large group of these the diagnosis double-blind placebo-controlled challenge?
We'll talk about it. We'll talk about it.
That seems like the obvious thing. I wouldn't do this stuff.
I know.
I was getting back to hocus pocus.
Yeah, I know. And this is after looking at these double-blind controlled trials. This is kind of what his thought is. I think, in food intolerance in general, my spiel is, I think listening to our patients is very important in clinical practice, as we all know. I think educating our patients, as I talked about, is very important. I think it's important for them to know what we can and cannot test for. I think that if we just do a skin test and say they're negative and just say, look, you're fine, don't worry about it, that's just going to alienate a lot of patients. I think a lot of these patients clearly have real symptoms, and it's important that they know the difference between food intolerance and true allergy. And I think if we alienate them, they can certainly go on to do other testing that's not validated, such as IgG testing, for example, for foods, and they'll of course get results that might be more in line with what their expectations are. I tell my patients, look, in these cases, food intolerance is certainly possible, but aside from an avoidance and reintroduction trial, there's really not an accurate way to test for this. And you guys can chime in now or at the end about what you would do in these cases. And the exceptions, of course, would be celiac disease, which we talked about. You can test for lactose intolerance or fructose malabsorption with a breath test, but we don't actually do that routinely at the patient. So, at least giving our patients something to work with when they leave the office is reasonable. Now, some may argue, are we feeding to the whole food intolerance or sensitivity craze? Perhaps, but I think we would give them at least a few tools to work with the symptoms that they're presenting with. So let's talk in more detail about non-celiac gluten sensitivity. This is defined by symptoms that occur soon after ingestion of gluten. They do not have the typical serology or histology or genetic markers that we see with celiac disease. In general, they do not, and they don't experience any IgE-mediated food allergy or wheat allergy. There is significant overlap with IBS, and as we talked about, it is a trendy topic. These are some of the lists of symptoms that can be seen or attributed to non-celiac gluten sensitivity. I think the first list of classic symptoms would be what we would expect. And extraintestinal symptoms is a little, raises an eyebrow. What's going on here, especially when it comes to paresthesias and other symptoms, let's say foggy mind, etc. If you're a child, apparently the most common clinical manifestations have been, or systemic manifestations has been fatigue reported. Just a take-home point, remember this does not lead to small intestinal damage. When you look at celiac disease patients and patients with NCGS, which I'll call it here moving forward, their clinical picture is less severe. And you do not meet the criteria, these patients do not meet the criteria for celiac disease or IgE wheat allergy. Prevalence, I think honestly it's hard to measure. There's no real strong epidemiologic studies on this, but it's around 3 to 6% for what that's worth. And this is largely because there's a lack of real ways to confirm the presence of NCGS. There's no real biomarkers or objective diagnostic criteria available. A lot of patients are actually self-diagnosing the condition, and there's theories about pathogenesis, but we really don't know.
Before you go any further, you said that they have to have a reaction to gluten without meeting criteria. Is that a double-blind reaction to gluten, or is this their self-reported reaction to?
Well, obviously, if they come to your office, it'll be self-reported. But yes, so the double-blind studies will go over. And some of these patients have been blinded, and then they'll still have a reaction to gluten.
So there is a true reaction.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And of course, those studies weren't perfect, right? We'll talk about that.
At least they tried.
Yeah, they tried, exactly. So, a lot of this is kind of redundant. I mean, testing should be negative in celiac disease and wheat allergy. Symptoms must occur with ingestion and improve with a gluten-free diet. And in some cases, when we talked about serology, we know that the anti-gluten antibodies for celiac disease is not the best test, but IgG for AGA has been shown to be elevated for what it's worth. In some of these patients, in some studies, it's shown to be higher. Could that be helpful? I probably wouldn't get this lab on your average patient presenting with this. And it may be more common in those with a family history of celiac disease, which is interesting. And about 50% of patients with NCGS carry, which is interesting, carry the HLA, DQ, and D8 genotypes, slightly above the general population.
Dave?
Yes.
In my patients who've been through the alternative route, a lot of them are coming in with the HLA testing. And did you see the rates of that test that are being done, or do we have an understanding of how many people are doing it now?
Yeah, I don't know. I've seen that too in some of my patients. I don't know how often it's...
They're drawing from the associations to try to make a diagnosis, and it's really kind of like a belief system looking for science to back it up. And so I wish they didn't do that.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you screen the general population,
You're gonna get
we're all going to be,
positives.
we could be positive for some of these things. I mean, it's like getting an ANA on 500 people.
If we're going to give the diagnosis anyway, why bother doing the test?
Right. And so testing, I don't think would be the answer in this case. Yeah. So the treatment of this is a gluten-free diet. We really don't know what the quote-unquote threshold for these patients would be. I personally don't think that it would be strict as you would see in celiac disease, but that could. They really haven't studied the actual, very small trace amounts. They've actually just given patients direct gluten, as we'll talk about. So where's the evidence? We've been talking about this here for a while. So, some of the first reports of this were in 1978. One of the first case reports looking at a patient with diarrhea and intermittent abdominal pain, and had no abnormalities on biopsy, but improved on a gluten-free diet. Okay. And then there was, in 1980, was a case series looking at 8 female adult patients with abdominal pain and chronic diarrhea. These patients had good relief on a gluten-free diet, but after the gluten was put back in their diet, they had a return of symptoms. And interestingly, so jejunal biopsies in these patients showed some changes in cellularity. Now, couldn't actually pull this article. Cellularity, I'm assuming they're thinking about intraepithelial lymphocytes possibly, which we'll talk about again in the next few slides.
I missed that.
Yeah.
Was that blinded?
This one?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know. This one wasn't. This one was. I don't think this was blinded. No. This is so. The University of Maryland has published some studies looking at the retrospective data for what it's worth. We're getting there as far as the blindness studies go. And so they felt that retrospectively there's a good chunk of patients that fulfill criteria for NCGS. Okay, and these were the symptoms here in yellow. Now, we need more compelling evidence, right? We want our double-blind, placebo-controlled studies, and one was in 2011, one was in 2012, and we talked about these patients did, or these researchers did try, and it's a tough thing to do. So this was a study. The first study was the lead author is a PhD nutritionist from Australia, and she's, from what I've read, studied this relatively extensively, and the design of these studies is well done, I think. 34 patients, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled re-challenge trial, where they had IBS patients where celiac disease was actually excluded, and who were symptomatically controlled on a gluten-free diet. Then they were challenged with either placebo or gluten in the form of 2 bread slices plus 1 muffin per day containing gluten or not containing gluten. And in the gluten challenge group, about 68% reported that their symptoms were not controlled after challenge, compared to 40% on placebo. So interesting. Now, it doesn't tell us anything about the mechanism involved here, but does kind of highlight that this NCGS may actually exist.
Wait, Dave, are we to believe then that the person cannot tell the difference between a gluten-containing slice of bread and
Well, there's some limitations, right? I mean, does it have the? I mean, I didn't. So here's another disclaimer: is the American Journal of Gastroenterology in the UW system. I can't pull the paper; we don't have it, and so so I got the abstract in these couple of. A lot of these studies are from this journal. Yeah, disclosure. So I couldn't pull it, but that's a good point, and that's what I was thinking about it. Can't they tell that it's less chewy? It doesn't just flakes off. I mean, I think you'd hope that they would have controlled for that, but that would be a limitation of the study. This study was actually retrospective, but and that's obviously a limitation in and of itself. But they looked at about 276 patients with wheat sensitivity, and these patients were diagnosed with a double-blind, placebo-controlled challenge in over a 10-year period. So they looked back and they found that there were 2 groups, one with wheat sensitivity alone, the other with wheat sensitivity associated with multiple food hypersensitivity, and those multiple foods were cow's milk, egg, tomato, and chocolate, kind of a good mixture of different things. As a group, just those patients who were wheat sensitive in general had higher frequency of anemia, weight loss, and coexistent ATP for whatever that's worth, and also a history of food allergy in infancy. There was also a higher frequency in these patients, positive serum assays for anti-gluten antibodies, and I looked this up, cytometric basophil activation in vitro assays for whatever that's worth. And then they found that as far as histologically, that these wheat-sensitive patients had eosinophilic infiltration. Now you can see eosinophils in your duodenum and in your colon. I don't know how high this eosinophil concentration was, whether it was very significant or was it just in small amounts. I haven't seen this being reported in any other cases of NCGS, so this was kind of a first when I looked this up. And so really conclusions with this study, which I think is not as compelling, really confirms the existence, what they felt as 2 distinct entities where you have non-celiac wheat sensitivity, but also a multiple food hypersensitivity group. And they felt that those patients who were wheat sensitive just in general as a group had similar characteristics to celiac disease, with the other being more toward patients who had food allergy or ATP. I'm not sure what to make of this study too much. And the next study, which I think is the most interesting, is looking at it's really a follow-up study from the first study that we talked about. Same researcher from Australia, actually then the PhD nutritionist who's done a lot of work in this area. They looked at did a placebo-controlled crossover rechallenge study in 37 subjects. We'd like to see more patients, but that was one limitation. 37 subjects is a decent amount, but clearly I don't think enough to make huge recommendations based on it. And they looked at patients with NCGS and irritable bowel syndrome. And what they did, in order to control for other potential triggers, they actually put these patients on a FODMAPs diet. Have you guys, we all heard of this? Yeah, so it's, one of these diets that's been shown to be, shown some promise for patients with irritable bowel syndrome. FODMAPs stands for fermentable oligodimonosaccharides and polyols. And the thought is that FODMAPs are found in a variety of scenarios, including certain grains and gluten-containing. So there's fructose. When they look at short-chain carbohydrates, fructose would be in that list. Lactose, fructan, which can be found in wheat, onion, and garlic. Galactans, which is legumes, and then the polyol, which is a lot of these sweeteners like sorbitol and mannitol. And certain stone fruits, so pitted fruits, can actually contain some of these polyols. So these patients were put on this relatively strict diet with all these different foods being eliminated. And the thought with this whole FODMAP thing is, as I mentioned, touched on a little earlier, these things can cause luminal distension, and they have osmotic effects, so the full gut, and also induce gas production. And it's been thought to be a substrate for bacterial fermentation, and that can cause problems, but possibly in the large and small intestine. Interesting, and a lot of these patients with IBS who put on this have had significant improvement. In this study, once they put all of these patients on the FODMAPs diet, they were then randomly assigned to diets containing either a high gluten diet, low gluten diet, or control. And the control was just pure whey protein. And interestingly, they found that the GI symptoms were consistently and significantly improved during a reduced FODMAP in all patients, but significantly worsened to a similar degree whether their diet contained gluten or whey protein. So gluten didn't seem to cause any issue when compared just to whey itself. And only 8% of participants, which is kind of contrary to what we saw in the previous two studies, only 8% of participants really had any specific gluten, any effects of gluten specifically. And then so afterwards, these patients were crossed over again, rechallenged for 3 days with the same 3 different diets. And during this whole rechallenge, all the symptoms increased by similar levels. So, based on this, it was really concluded that there was no evidence for a dose-dependent effect of gluten. And it really kind of puts into question the whole existence of NCGS itself. So I think could the answer just be this whole FODMAP study? And it's pretty compelling moving forward. And I think obviously larger studies are needed.
Did they do any bowel biopsies to exclude eosinophilic bowel disorders when they were doing this?
They did. Let me see. Let me look and see.
Your one comment said there were more eosinophils than normal. But
yeah, in the other study, I'm going to touch on a study that had bowel biopsy. I don't think they actually biopsied in this study. They did get labs. They looked at interferon gamma, gliadin-specific T cells. They looked at anti-gliadin antibodies. And they did GI symptom scores and stool studies. I don't think they actually biopsied these patients in this study. This next study they did, and this is kind of interesting. All of these studies raise an eyebrow. I don't think we're going to leave here today to say, well, this is exactly what's happening, and we're going to have strong science on this. But it's interesting to look into. This group of patients end up underwent biopsy. So these patients, this group out of University of Maryland looked at mucosal expression of genes associated with intestinal barrier function, and they looked at innate and adaptive immunity in celiac disease compared with gluten sensitivity. And they wanted to look at the similarities and differences between the two. And so they ended up getting celiac disease patients, healthy controls were just dyspeptic patients. And they enrolled these patients in this study. They looked at intestinal permeability. And by doing that, we'll talk about what they use as a lactose and mannitol probe. And they also did biopsies in these patients. So the definition of NCGS is really what we had talked about earlier. I think it's important to know how they define NCGS in these patients. And these patients had symptoms triggered by gluten exposure and alleviated by gluten withdrawal. They had ruled out celiac disease, ruled out true wheat allergy, and also they excluded patients with other overlapping autoimmune diseases. And all subjects underwent a gluten challenge, and it was under clinical supervision for 4 months. At the end of the challenge, these patients underwent serology for celiac, they underwent HLA typing, and had biopsies, as we talked about. And then after endoscopy, they were placed back on a gluten-free diet, and the symptoms were monitored over time. The patients who had NCGS had negative autoantibody serology for endomucil antibody and TTG, which have good sensitivity and specificity. Best for TTG, as we know. They also had normal mucosa, and some of them may have had increased intraepithelial lymphocytes. No mention of eosinophils, and that was the only study that we talked about that ever mentioned eosinophils in some of these biopsies. And improvement of symptoms within days of diet implementation. So this is kind of a detailed table, really just going to point out these were the dyspeptic controls, these were the celiac patients, and these were the patients with gluten sensitivity, also known as NCGS. We want to point out that no extraintestinal manifestations or symptoms in the dyspeptic controls. Their intestinal symptoms were just dyspepsia. In gluten sensitivity, they did have a list here, but when we look at celiac disease, the list seems to be more elaborate and possibly more severe, as we talked about. Gluten-sensitive patients tend to have a less severe phenotype. And interestingly, for whatever it's worth, 48% of patients with gluten sensitivity were AGA positive. They looked at IgA and IgG combined. They didn't see that they actually separated that. And then 57% were HLA DQ or DQ8 positive. Now this is, a little higher than the general population. 48% is higher than we would normally expect to see for whatever it's worth. And of course, when they looked at TTG, it was negative for dyspeptic controls, negative for gluten-sensitive patients, and endomucil antibodies were also negative, both of which, as we talked about, are clearly better tests than AGA. Those are some basic things to point out on this table. So this was one of the figures. We're not going to go over all 6 figures that were in the study. We'll go over a few of them. The first figure looked at intestinal permeability, and they did this with urinary lactulose and mannitol. And the ratio is really what we want to look at. And interestingly, in gluten-sensitive patients, as far as significant results, they found that in these gluten-sensitive patients, intestinal permeability was actually reduced. So it kind of goes against this whole, this leaky gut hypothesis, where these patients have a leaky gut and they have increased intestinal permeability, and that's why they're having all these problems. In this study, gluten-sensitive patients had reduced intestinal permeability compared to controls and celiac patients. They also, and not shown necessarily in this figure, but also showed that they had an increased expression of claudin, which is, to be honest, I had to look up, the transmembrane protein, which plays a critical role in tight junctions. And so patients with gluten sensitivity actually had significantly increased expression of claudin, for what it's worth. The other figure that I want to point out was figure 4, looking at adaptive immunity markers. So they looked at IL-6, they looked at interferon gamma, and they looked at IL-21. And they were actually expressed as expected at higher levels in celiac disease, but not in gluten sensitivity. And that was, I would think, in line with what we would expect. This is interesting. We're not sure exactly what it necessarily means, but they actually looked at TLR as well. So TLR 1, 2, and 4, and they found that in patients with gluten sensitivity, as far as any significant results, that the TLR2 was increased in these patients, but not in celiac disease patients. And this next table, or next figure, which is figure 6, is really contrary to what we would think. We think of celiac disease as the autoimmune disease, whereas gluten sensitivity doesn't necessarily have any relationship with other autoimmune diseases. However, the expression of FOXP3, which we know is a T regulatory cell marker, was significantly actually reduced in gluten-sensitive patients relative to controls and celiac disease patients. What that means, again, we're not entirely sure, but I think it highlights that something's going on, and this, at least in this study, that patients with gluten sensitivity have more of an innate, if they are having a response, an innate immune response rather than an adaptive immune response, and that these two disorders are clearly different clinical entities. And I don't think we can make strong conclusions on this stuff, but it does raise an eyebrow. Go ahead.
Just kind of possibly related to this. This is a question from Ray Brady, thinking in what I talked about with sinus disease. Is there any evidence for local intestinal allergy?
Is there any evidence for local intestinal allergy?
In other words, has anyone looked for IgE just there, not systemic?
Oh, I see what you're saying. I don't think they did in these studies. A lot of these studies just got serum IgE to weed or bleed and that sort of thing.
And the second question, any trials of oral cromolyn?
That's a good question. I didn't run into that, but I didn't look specifically at oral cromolyn, but that would be interesting. I did not see any studies on oral cromolyn. Good question. One of the last studies here that we'll talk about when it comes to NCGS. One thing I didn't mention with the last study, I should say, going back, they looked at, I don't know why I left this out, they looked at intraepithelial lymphocytes, and we have touched on this. Patients with this type of control had none. Patients with celiac disease, as it's expected, had a high number of intraepithelial lymphocytes. Patients with gluten sensitivity did have about in between, so they did have intraepithelial lymphocytes. As I mentioned, this study kind of looks at this as well. And they looked at 30 patients, again from the American Journal of Gastroenterology. They looked at 30 patients with NCGS and 15 celiac disease patients. They were all on a gluten-free diet, and then they challenged them with gluten-containing bread. And it really showed that NCGS patients had a higher density of intraepithelial lymphocytes in their duodenal biopsies at baseline compared to controls, which was in line with the last study that I just mentioned. And then following gluten challenge, those patients with NCGS had a significant increase in interferon gamma mRNA, which is different than we saw in the last study. Really, in this study, they suggested now not necessarily an innate immune response, but an adaptive immune system, or immune response, I should say, may play a role. So we're seeing some conflicting things here. So some conclusions, if we can draw any conclusions from these studies, is that the majority of symptoms associated with NCGS are clearly subjective. That said, there have been some double-blind studies looking at looking at the reproducibility of this in a subset of patients. There's really no objective criteria for its diagnosis. These patients with NCGS might show an increased rise in epithelial cell counts or intraepithelial lymphocytes. In that one study, we saw some increased eosinophils. That's the first time, again, that I saw that. Higher frequency of positive serum assays for AGA, for whatever that's worth, and also a possible association with HLA, DQ2 and DQ8 haplotypes compared to controls. And whether the innate or adaptive immune system is involved, it's really hard to really tell, but it seems that some sort of immune response is happening. So when you do a search for gluten sensitivity, a lot of things pop up, and there's some websites out there that promote this gluten sensitive, the symptoms of being gluten sensitive, and it can range from, like we said, paresthesias to hormone imbalance, and of these many things, autism is one of them. I don't necessarily want to go into every detail of every study because I think the evidence is not necessarily there yet. But the thought is that theory here is that these patients with autism have increased intestinal permeability, which has been shown in small groups. There's a study looking at 8 patients showed to have some increased intestinal permeability. So that the theory is that these patients have this, and that predisposes them that when they eat gluten or casein, actually leaks into the gut, causing excessive opioid activity and resulting in behaviors. Kevin.
I've never understood this concept of leaky gut or permeability.
Right.
That it's even a pathologic condition or that it exists.
Right.
It's probably too loaded of a question, but as it pertains to this, because you're pre-assuming that there's a pathologic condition in the gut that would allow then the things to go through that are also bad, therefore causing a problem. So, what's leaky gut?
Yeah, I know. I mean, that's a theory. I mean, we looked at intestinal permeability. They looked at intestinal permeability in the last study, of patients with non-celiac gluten sensitivity, right? So, I mean, they're trying to. What is leaky gut? I mean,
I think it's part of the belief system that you have a pathologic condition in the gut that leads then to all these other downstream problems.
Right.
But we can't even get our definitions straight.
Of what is leaky gut? I mean,
or
I'm
small
not sure if I
bowel
can answer
overgrowth.
that. Right.
Right. So it's like it's a belief system that exists first, and then you go looking for causes for that perceived problem.
Exactly.
That's why I think it's really hard for the science to bear it out when you start with. You decide that gluten is a problem as a belief system, and then you work backwards from there to try to prove it.
Right. Right. Exactly. And I think that's the running theory. I mean, it'd be interesting to see larger studies looking at intestinal permeability in a lot of these patients. And I think exactly if you could disprove that there is an increased intestinal permeability, then that could disprove a lot of this stuff. So these are running theories and hypotheses, definitely not backed up by strong science. There was. I'm going to cut to the chase here, since just to leave a few minutes at the end. I didn't think we were going to be able to talk about this in detail, but there was a systematic review in 2008, for what it's worth, looking at 2 small randomized controlled trials evaluating the gluten-free and casein-free diet. Casein is also in this mix in children with autism spectrum disorder, and one found that the combined GFCF diet reduced autistic traits, and the other found really no difference in outcome measures. There's a couple other studies here. One in 2010, which we won't necessarily go over in detail, and then one in both in 2010, I'm sorry, looking at a good chunk of children with autism spectrum. One didn't really show much. The other, maybe a possible short-term improvement on a gluten-free, casein-free diet. The take-home with this is that there's not good science to back us up on a gluten casein-free diet, and I don't think it should be broadly recommended for all these patients with autism. Now, if it's a child and you're going to put them on some sort of elimination of gluten and casein, that's fine. I really highly recommend dietitians, particularly for children, if we're going to do this. And I don't think it should be done for an extended amount of time, perhaps a month or 2 or 3. I'm not sure if we're going to put them on it blindly forever. This is a study looking at, it actually was relatively well designed. It looked at 37 patients. I'm going to go to the conclusion. They just found in their studies that IgG levels, anti-gluten antibodies, not necessarily IgA, IgG was elevated for whatever that means. We don't necessarily know. And there was no increased levels of celiac disease, IgG, etc. They did not get those diseases. The conclusions for this study was that immune reactivity to gluten or gluten specifically, and they weren't really sure necessarily what that meant. Gluten ataxia, we should know what it means. Random neurologic symptoms, possibly secondary to gluten. I think we should be very cautious of this diagnosis. Just know that it exists. Now that you've heard of it, there's no good, solid studies to back up these claims, but I think it, again, raises an eyebrow. And I think lastly, just for the final thoughts, I think that I don't think we can ignore, based on some of these double-blinded studies, that patients do have reproducible symptoms. So I don't think it's just a placebo effect when it comes to patients who have symptoms with gluten. If they don't have celiac disease or wheat allergy, I think we should still consider them possibly gluten intolerant and go from there. And I think blindly putting patients on a gluten-free diet for an extended amount of time is probably not the right thing to do. I think it is high cost, it could be difficult in time consuming, and it could lead to nutritional deficiencies. Possibly, patients are doing it for decades. I think patient education is key, so we don't alienate our patients, and so they don't seek unvalidated testing elsewhere. And I think, again, look, we were talking about science. We shouldn't be guided by anecdotes. We should be guided by strong scientific evidence. Frankly, what I showed you today, I'm not sure if it would be strong scientific evidence, but I think it's compelling scientific evidence. We can leave it open for discussion. Any questions? Yeah, I like this one. Something is just not right. Our air is clean, our water is pure. We all get plenty of exercise. Everything we eat is organic and free range. Yet nobody lives past 30.
I guess the broad philosophical question is, do you actually need science to get a treatment effect? And I think we're talking about the placebo effect.
Yeah, a lot of these patients could be placebo effect, at least the ones that come through our office.
But the thing is, they're also being treated, so if we spend so much time talking, whatever needs to be treated, but they feel better subjectively after they have these elimination trials. And while our learned colleagues in the alternative community are not burdened by science, to prove their point, we sometimes rely too much on science and we kind of forget what the chief complaint was, and so we send them away saying, well, it's not real, there's no test.
Right.
And they're going to turn around and go somewhere else anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
I think there is a test.
What's the test?
Double-blind placebo-controlled trial. And that's what I offer them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Most of them don't want to do it. Most of them don't come back. They take cumbersome. It's the only way you can find out when you have subjective symptoms and you have no objective markers.
These subjective problems too, I think. There's subjective problems too, and so.
So Gary, do you do that in your office then?
Yes, I do. Although
do you use wheat capsules?
Most don't want to do it. Most don't really want to find out. They're believers, and they don't want to know.
I think that's great that you offer that. Do you use wheat capsules?
I do capsules, and I don't know that mine's the most scientific either, but it's at least a try. But if they have all the same symptoms on placebo, then you can say, hey, you're wrong. I break the code. I have 4 challenges, 2 with the real stuff and 2 with placebo, and have them record all their symptoms and then come back.
I think that FODMAP's diet, I think we'll probably look it up and maybe it'll gain more steam here. Maybe we can do some larger studies. That's interesting. Be interesting to see where that goes.
Well, first, that was an awesome summary of all this weird data.
Yeah,
Thanks.
try to.
And unfortunately, now that I've become one of the old guys in this group, I'm thinking that this is very similar to the yeast connection stuff from 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And basically, they made them eat a good diet. They felt better. So everybody was happy. There's no science at all. 1/3 of the patients were symptom-free.
Exactly.
Another third thought we were crazy.
And you mentioned yeast. Then we look at all the foods.
Basically wheat.
Well, yeah, but exactly, basically wheat. But then if you look at actually all the foods that contain yeast, it's a ton of foods. So a lot of these patients that are strictly adhering to a yeast-free diet, they're avoiding a ton of things.
They also would tend to decrease their carbohydrates.
Exactly, they decrease their carbohydrates.
Well, I think that's Kevin's point, is that a lot of times they've sort of given this diagnosis of yeast or whatever, based on whatever, and they're actually having a healthy diet for the first time in their life.
Right.
And they feel better, and then, kind of to Gary's point, sometimes it's hard to get them to undo that. Or that I really don't care about that. There's one question: am I allergic to turnips or something?
And we can provide negative skin tests in a lot of these patients.
Right.
It has good negative predictive value.
The whole flavor of that negatives could be used.
Exactly. We don't want to do a random battery of skin tests on every patient. If you did a 2 or 3 of them, if you want to do wheat and yeast for the sake of it being negative, that can be really helpful to say, look, now we ruled out IgE-mediated allergy. This is what we can do. We can do what Gary recommended have him come back, which I think is a great idea for a double-blinded challenge. And the approach from that guy from University of Virginia who just had said, look, let's just improve your diet overall and see how you do. And that way we're giving them something to do. We're actually validating their symptoms. And
Myself, I really blister at the idea of telling them just to have a better diet. Like, how many years of special training do we have to say, eat well, sleep well, don't drink too much?
And sometimes
me to tell you that.
Right, and a lot of people need a little. When you look at their dietary intake, it's not good. And some of these patients might just need the help of a dietitian.
Like a grandmother or office just feel on the wrist, remind them what to do.
Right. Yeah, I'm interested in this FODMAPs thing, and it'd be interesting to see where it goes. In larger studies. Go ahead. Yeah.
One thing about the FOXP3 expression, people usually check FOXP3 and suggest, say that you have reduced level of FOXP3, then something is dysregulated. But FOXP3 is expressed in every activated CD4 and CD8 T cell. So another way to look at it, it's not like something is dysregulated, but in fact I don't have any inflammation.
Right.
So maybe the fact that they have reduced FOXP3 suggests that everything is okay.
Exactly. Yeah. The fact that, okay, that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. Celiac disease? I always thought it was more autoimmune. Yeah. You think it's more allergic?
Yeah, because if you remove the causing agent, then you don't have the response anymore.
Right.
I know, it's kind of a...
No, yeah. And I think it's certainly related to other autoimmune disorders.
I've forgotten, does dapsone help with gastrointestinal symptoms? I know you're for DH. Did you see anything on that?
I didn't see any, but I didn't look at that specifically. Like Chromosome, I didn't look at it specifically. I didn't write it. The question was about dapsone.
Did any of the studies look at exercise as well as dietary change for health?
No, not that I could find. They didn't do any other lifestyle changes aside from dietary. I didn't see exercise on there, and that's a good point.
Like with fibromyalgia and stuff.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of moving parts here. I don't think it's just diet too. I mean, I think a lot of these patients who have paresthesias and depression and anxiety. I mean, I think a lot of these things, like a lifestyle change, would maybe everyone needs a nice, good lifestyle coach to help them. With diet and exercise, I think a lot of us could use that. Okay, so that's that. Hopefully that was helpful.
It's all clear now.
Yeah, it's all clear now. Exactly, clear as mud.
The one who has attended the naturopath and stopped eating wheat. So, and they won't go back to eating wheat.
And if you tell them you want to do the DQ2 and a DQ8 and their insurance won't cover it, they won't let you do it.
Yeah.
So that's always fun.
Jason, after that one. That's a good review of all the available stuff. That's brave to dive into that literature. It's painful. Non-scientific
Research, I mean, PhD. They don't know it themselves. They're all doing the same thing. They claim it. They mention science anyway.
That was awesome. I was just going to tell you, my sister got talked to by some naturopath, and he said she had celiac. And I asked her to get me a copy of the test. As soon as he found out he wouldn't give her a copy. I said, okay, that's a red flag. Then she had some test that I didn't, some intestinal permeability test. Yeah. Anyway, so then I said, okay, and I had done a review on celiac a few years ago. So for Christmas that year, I bought her an HLA DQ2 and an HLA DQ8 because her insurance wouldn't pay. And they were both negative, so I said, you can't have celiac disease, and now you shut down my screening periods because you said these are HLA DQ2 negative.
Right.
And they still have disease, but it's not celiac.
We don't have.
What's the natural history?
One of them, I mean, 50% of patients maybe are HLA.
Let's see, that's the thing. It's nice they were both negative. I could have been screwed. Had
They're
one of
both
been,
negative, then we're
had
good.
one of been positive, I was dead.
What's the life cycle of these alternative health beliefs, like the yeast thing? That was about 10 years.
It was 10 or 15 years, and it was really big. Yeah. And basically what it did is just said, eat a normal, healthy diet, and you'll feel better. And, you get on things like the Atkins diet, are they really nutritionally superior, or do they just pull wheat out and people feel better? And now you have 7 pounds of glom in your colon that you can get rid of and lose 7 pounds right away, and it's all wheat. That's the new one. Is you want to get purged and get rid of all your...
Well, there's also like that sort of subjective or placebo, but like a transformative event. Like I'm going to go, I'm going to have a new life now, I'm going to have a new diet, I'm going to feel better.
You can't exclude placebo. Dramatic improvement of placebo.
That's a major problem I think in our field is that we don't even try to use a placebo effect. And that's why, in a way, I'm sort of envious.
Look at the immunotherapy with ENT guys. A third of their patients have a dramatic improvement, lose all their symptoms, they get water.
We can't just
Mueller and they put everybody with chronic sinus disease on any fungals now. And I look at their serum, I go, now let me show you our serum, and then you look at theirs, and they let them give shots at home. Yeah, it's crystal clear. It's like brown colored. And I said, the reason we can't do this is we can kill you. They can't kill you, so you can't do it at home. But yeah, drum allergy are coming home.
That's the best criticism, though, of our field is that we don't use
There's also some real science.
But what I mean is that people who look at this whole handful, they don't do that at all. I don't want to.
Unfortunately, by us telling them nothing, we send them to these alternative providers. Oh my God, so we need to do something. Where's Drew? We should have set up a study.
But my own personal view is so cynical. Like, because the patient, there's also punishment for the physician because they have to deal with
more diet. Yes, I can see her 100%. No one ever.
But it's
Those are dangerous. Yeah, a lot of them actually get paid at the hospital.
Well, I'm glad they made it.
It's really sad. But
we really, I think, especially with emerging food activities.
I believe so as well. There's just a lot of that going on. I think we just got tape saying, you know,
Wow.
turn it off.
When you think East Connection 10 or 15 years?
All right.
Yeah, you see naturopaths making a lot.
All right, Matt. So I see back on all my patients.
I've seen that from time to time. Patients who are still on fluconazole, like, wow, that fad ran out.